All right, so this presentation will be on euthanasia, and I'm going to follow pretty closely James Rachels's really classic essay on this from the mid-70s, and I think he does a really good job of laying out sort of the basic issues involved and thinking clearly about the ethics of euthanasia. And of course, as the title suggests, he's going to explain the distinction between active and passive euthanasia. And just so you get a bit of a preview as to where he's going with this, he has actually a pair of arguments in favor of the moral permissibility of active euthanasia. So we'll see how that goes. All right, so just some stage setting here first. Euthanasia itself is killing somebody, but it's killing them because it's in their own interest to be killed. So that's what distinguishes it from murder or self-defense or other kinds of killing. Those others, it might be in the interest of the person who's doing the killing, right? They want to see this person dead, or they're trying to defend themselves against that person, so it's about the killer's interests. Whereas in euthanasia, it's about the interests of the person who's being killed. So of course, the stereotypical cases here are somebody who's terminally ill, or they're really seriously injured, so they're at the end of their life anyway, and they want to not have it be prolonged. And as the title of his essay suggests, there is this important distinction between active euthanasia and passive euthanasia. So active euthanasia is where we're taking specific action to end somebody's life as quickly as possible. Oftentimes in a medical setting, this might be perhaps an overdose of morphine, right? So that the person basically just sort of passes out and they never wake up and their heart stops and they die. And so this is ending somebody's life as quickly as possible. Whereas with passive euthanasia, instead of taking specific action to end somebody's life, instead we're withholding any efforts to extend their life. Of course, we're also withholding efforts to extend somebody's life in active euthanasia, but then we're taking this extra step of ending it extra fast. Whereas with passive euthanasia, it's just withholding, right? So you stop giving them any kind of life-saving treatment or life-extending treatment. This would be, when people say pull the plug, so to speak, on any kind of life support mechanisms. Then you just allow the person to sort of die kind of on their own after that. And so it could take minutes, it could take hours or days or months, who knows. It could take a very long time for somebody to die after passive euthanasia has been agreed on as the best course to take. Okay, the other thing to make clear is the issue of consent. And so we actually have three categories of consent to deal with. So voluntary is sort of the obvious one. So the patient is specifically requesting, sort of verbally or written or somehow or another, they're making their intentions known that they want to either be allowed to die, right, with passive euthanasia, or they want to be actively put out of their misery, right, for active euthanasia. Involuntary is when the patient specifically says, no, I do not want to be euthanized. Maybe I specifically want to continue with the life extending treatment of one kind or another, medication or some kind of physical mechanism or whatever it is to try to keep the person alive as long as possible. Then there's non-voluntary, which isn't the same as involuntary. In non-voluntary situations, this is where the person involved cannot make their interests known one way or another. They can't speak, or they just can't express themselves. Perhaps they're in a coma, or they're just sort of too injured somehow, or they're under too many medications in order to be able to really clearly make their intentions known. And then, of course, it's up to the family or other loved ones, or perhaps in some cases the medical staff at a hospital, to make the decision as to whether the person should be passively or actively euthanized or just continue to receive treatment. Okay, so on to then Rachel's actual essay here. So he begins it by making it describing the law in the United States of America, first of all, which is consistent with also the American Medical Association. Pretty much all doctors, at least, need to be members of the American Medical Association and sort of abide by its guidelines. Both the United States law and the American Medical Association both allow for the permissibility of passive euthanasia, right? So you can withdraw treatment, you can unplug the life support systems or whatever it might be that is extending somebody's life. You can withdraw those and allow the person to sort of die on their own. So that's passive euthanasia, that's legal and that's allowed. But both of them say that it's morally impermissible to conduct active euthanasia. Right, so it's illegal and it's against the policies of the American Medical Association to actively try to end somebody's life, even when it's in that person's own interest, or it seems to be in that person's own interest to die as soon as possible. Okay, so then, as I said, James Rachels is going to argue in favor of the permissibility of active euthanasia. It's already widely agreed that passive euthanasia is permissible, and so his job is to show that active euthanasia is permissible as well. And really his argument sort of has two parts. In fact, it's almost two separate arguments in a way. The first one is a consequentialist argument. It's actually kind of a utilitarian argument. And he's trying to show, first of all, that the American Medical Association's policy, and then also the US law by extension, is inconsistent and that it should allow active euthanasia. And then the second part is where he takes more of a deontological or non-consequentialist approach to show that the act of passive euthanasia and active euthanasia aren't as different as we thought they were. And that there's not some extra moral baggage, so to speak, associated with active euthanasia that is not present in passive euthanasia. Okay, so first part. So first of all, it seems from their own literature that the American Medical Association's policy on the permissibility of passive euthanasia, that's based on utilitarianism. That is, if somebody is suffering, right, there's no real chance of them to recover from their injury, their illness, or their age. They're really only going to get worse and worse, and they're going to feel more and more suffering. Then so this reasoning goes, it doesn't make sense to take specific actions to extend that person's life. If they don't want it extended, why override their interests and instead take all these efforts to extend their life when all you're really doing is extending their suffering? So, they're going to either just go on and on suffering and then die, or suffer for a substantially less amount of time and then die. So it's death in both cases. It's just that in one of the cases, clearly there's more suffering. And so they say it's okay to withdraw treatment so that you're not intentionally extending that period of suffering. So that's basically utilitarianism, right? Minimizing suffering. But of course, maybe you're sort of anticipating where this is going, that active euthanasia does a far better job of that, right? The idea is the plan is for the person to die, right? We acknowledge that no recovery is going to happen, that death in a relatively short amount of time is the inevitable outcome here. And that the reason why we're engaging in passive euthanasia is to decrease suffering. And so if the point is to decrease suffering or to not extend suffering, then the obviously better option is active euthanasia, right? Because that cuts the period of suffering down even shorter. Now, some might say, well, yes, but the family members, the other loved ones, they want to still have this person around. They don't want to lose them faster than they have to. So if active euthanasia is taken, then that cuts that person's life even shorter, and the survivors will be sad. They will suffer because their loved one will be dead sooner. Well, we could maybe question, how much benefit is from having a person that's suffering and dying to go ahead and allow their life to continue on when their suffering could be cut shorter. How much happiness is really maintained there, even for the family members. But Rachel says that, and he's taking kind of a standard utilitarian reasoning here, that the suffering that the family members would feel at the person dying sooner, at the patient dying sooner, is outweighed by the suffering felt by the patient themselves at having their life extended, just so that the family can sort of see them alive for a little bit longer. So all things considered, it seems like overall less suffering will exist if we just end this life sooner. So this is the permissibility of active euthanasia. Of course, he doesn't want to say it's mandatory, right? If the patient doesn't want to be actively euthanized, then we're not going to involuntarily euthanize them. But if they want to be euthanized early, right, they want active euthanasia, or maybe in cases of non-voluntary a situation where the person's in a coma or something, where they just are incapable of expressing their interests one way or another, then maybe active euthanasia should be permissible. Okay, so that's sort of the utilitarian argument in favor of active euthanasia, and that's fairly straightforward. But of course, not everybody's a utilitarian and not everybody's a consequentialist. So for people who are more deontologists or sort of reject pure consequentialist reasoning, Rachels feels the need to then have this other argument that tries to show that there really isn't this significant moral difference between active euthanasia and passive euthanasia. And in fact, he does it at a more general level, where he tries to show that there's no moral difference overall between active killing and passive killing, regardless of the situation. And so if there's no general difference between active killing and passive killing, then there's no difference between active euthanasia, a particular case of killing, and passive euthanasia. Okay, so the way that he does this is an argument by analogy, which is a fairly well-established method in applied ethics, where we've got a particular question, right, the permissibility of active euthanasia, and people might have very strong opinions about it already, or they might feel very strong emotional reactions when this issue is brought up. So it's not a good strategy to try to just directly try to change somebody's mind just talking about the thing that they're most concerned with, in this case, active euthanasia. And instead, the author constructs a different situation, a different scenario that has the same moral features as the one that they're interested in, but is a little easier to sort of reason about, that people don't already have set opinions about. And so then we come to a conclusion about this other analogous scenario, and then we take that reasoning and we transfer it over to the issue that we're really interested in this case, of course, the permissibility of active euthanasia. Okay, so here's his analogous situation. We have this uncle who's sort of the sole caretaker for his very young nephew, maybe a year old or something like that. And sort of the family sort of finances overall are set up such that if the nephew dies, the uncle inherits a lot of money. And so this uncle, who's apparently not a very good person, he wants the money, and so he decides to kill the nephew. And the way he's going to do it is he's going to set things up to make it look like an accident, that the child accidentally slipped, bumped his head in the bathtub, fell into the water and drowned. And so that seemed like to the uncle that it's plausibly could be thought of as an accident. He won't be found responsible, and so he'll get the money. Okay, so now Rachel sort of splits the scenario into two different outcomes, right? One's a passive outcome and one's an active outcome. The active outcome is case one here, where the uncle just carries out his plan, right? He goes into the bathroom, and bonks the kid on the head and holds the kid under the water. This is really horrible, but this is the case. And then the child dies. But he does it in such a way that then when the authorities show up or whatever, it will look like it was just an accident, like he wasn't around and didn't know it was happening or something. That's how he's going to set it up. But then in the second situation, the uncle shows up and he's into the bathroom and he's ready to sort of carry out his horrible plan. But just before he's able to carry out the plan, the child actually does slip and actually bumps his head, falls unconscious and falls under the water and drowns. But of course the uncle is standing there and just decides to do nothing, right? And so he just watches the child drown right there in front of him. He doesn't do anything active to either cause the situation to happen or to stop the situation from happening. So the second case is a case of passive killing, right? He allowed the child to die when he could very easily have saved the child. Whereas in the first case, this is an active case, right? He actively murdered the child. So then Rachel's asks us, obviously these are both really bad. Are they the same amount bad, right? So the uncle's moral guilt here, is he equally morally guilty in both of these cases? And, can maybe anticipate that Rachel's thinks that the uncle is equally guilty in both cases. His moral blame is the same in both of these situations. And if that's the case, then there doesn't seem to be any significant moral difference between the two methods, right? In one case, he actively killed the child, and in the other one, he sort of passively allowed the child to die. But he's equally guilty in both cases, so there's really no difference, says James Rachels, between active killing and passive killing. That ultimately, once the decision has been made that death is the outcome, then the way that you get to that death is sort of irrelevant, at least from a moral perspective. It's irrelevant. You're equally guilty either way. So then, now that he's come to this conclusion in the analogous case, now we bring it over to euthanasia. And remember, the conclusion from the analogy is that there's no moral difference between active killing and passive killing. Well, if that's the case, then this whole initial idea that active euthanasia is far worse than passive euthanasia seems to not hold up anymore, right? There's just no difference between the two, morally speaking. Of course, there's differences in the causal details of how you get to the death, but nevertheless, the case that he made with the analogy was that there's really no moral difference there. That's morally irrelevant, how you actually get to the death. The morally relevant thing is the decision that death is going to be the outcome. So the conclusion then here is that active euthanasia should be permissible because it's really just a mistake, says James Rachels. It's a mistake to think that there was a difference, that there was a significant moral difference to begin with between active euthanasia and passive euthanasia. And so then it really does fall down to the choices of the family and the patient and so on. What do they think? There should not be any standard law or standard policy from the American Medical Association prohibiting active euthanasia. So since he wrote this, there's actually been a lot of changes in the laws, at least at the state level in the United States. So currently, as of October 2020, there are a variety of states that do have laws on the books saying that under special circumstances, active euthanasia is allowed, or as they sometimes call it, physician-assisted suicide or death with dignity and so on. So California, Colorado, the District of Columbia, Hawaii, Maine, New Jersey, Oregon, Vermont, and Washington State all have it legal for active euthanasia now. And to a certain extent, they would be using James Rachels' style of thinking, whether they realized they were following this particular philosopher or not. Okay, so that gets us to the end of this presentation, so I'll go ahead and stop there.